we're up against some really interesting talks in the other session too. So thank y'all for sticking with me on this one. So I'm going to talk about a project that's wrapping up right now. It's kind of work in progress, but it's hopefully going to launch in the next few weeks, called the Health Indicators Project. And it's a project that I'm working on with DataWorks North Carolina, which is a nonprofit based in Durham, North Carolina. Myself, I'm a worker owner at Research Action Design. We're a worker co-op that uses community-led research, collaborative design of tech and media to build the power of grassroots social movements. And I wanted to lift up the worker co-op piece. I don't know if anyone saw Katie Kowalski's talk yesterday about like all the hats that cartographers have to wear and how we should get paid more. That's something that we try to do because we own the business. So it's a really interesting model, and I've been excited about the growth of tech co-ops. I think there's actually a lot of room for that space. So if anybody wants to talk about that as well at lunch. And then DataWorks is a really cool model as a nonprofit as well. It's been around for a few years. It started out of a product called the Durham Neighborhood Compass that our neighborhood improvement services in the city developed. That's a data portal for looking at neighborhood-based data that has a lot of cool features, and that kind of spun off into its own nonprofit, so it could have some independence from the city, but still get funded from the city. And one of the things that brings us together in this work that we really share in common is this idea that there is a really important conversation to be had between quantitative data about neighborhoods and local knowledges from folks that actually live in neighborhoods across the city and are also the folks that are going to be able to change their neighborhoods. And so we both really focus, RAD through co-design, DataWorks through data workshops and outreach efforts on bringing data and community members into conversation in a productive way and putting both of those kinds of knowledges on a flat plane. So I'm going to give a little bit of background of the project. I'm going to talk about a design process, which I thought was really interesting. This time we had the luxury of a decent amount of funding and a decent amount of time to really dig into participatory design in this project, which was exciting. I'll give a demo of the site, and I'll talk a little bit about the technologies that we used to build it, and then some questions that this approach is raising for us that kind of is causing me to rethink some traditional kind of cartography approaches. And then I want to give a big shout out to user testing as a process. So I'll talk a little bit about how we do that and why it's been helpful for us. So first, a little bit of background. This project happened because the Durham County Health Department wanted to start working with neighborhood-based health data. And it just so happens in Durham County that we have a single medical system, Duke Healthcare, which sees 90% of the patients in the county through one of their hospitals or clinics. They also manage a community health clinic that sees a large number of folks who are lower income. And so they've moved to an electronic medical record system, as most of the country has, and that means that they have electronic medical data on basically the entire population of the county. So that's really exciting because now we can get really detailed, up-to-the-minute information about what health conditions people in neighborhoods across the county are actually experiencing. And so our county health department formally requested that data from Duke in 2015, and they provided the first pilot set of it to us last year in 2017, and that was specifically around diabetes. This project is going to expand to include a number of other chronic conditions like kidney disease, mental health, cancer. But we wanted to really use diabetes as a test case to figure out how to do this right. So a few of the things that make chronic health information really interesting to work with and challenging, and why we wanted to take so long and really put an intentional process into this, is that chronic health conditions are super linked to both race and place. So there's a lot of work, and I'm not an epidemiologist, so I'm not like super familiar with all of this literature, but that, for example, people in majority African American neighborhoods, regardless of their own race, have worse chronic health outcomes. So the outcomes are linked to place in some way. There's some characteristic of high poverty places and majority African American and majority people of color places across the US that causes folks to have higher chronic health outcomes. And of course, information like that can be super stigmatizing as well to folks with particular racial identities and particular neighborhoods. And there's also this real link with diabetes, particularly to individual behaviors. So diabetes is linked to things like obesity, things like exercise, things like diet. All of these are super cultural, they're super individual. So we really wanted to figure out how to use this data productively without just saying, okay, this neighborhood has high diabetes, right? Because people don't walk and they don't make good choices about food. One, because that's not true. And two, because it's not helpful. It's not going to change people's behaviors or change the characteristics of neighborhoods. And diabetes is also really, part of this race-class link is really an influence of chronic environmental stress. And there's a lot of work in public health, and we're really lucky in Durham County to have a director of public health in the health department who is championing this idea that if you think about health as an iceberg, right, the conditions that a doctor can treat are like the tip of the iceberg, and all the other stuff that influences health is around chronic stress, race and class, adverse childhood experiences, all kinds of stuff that people walk into the room with when they come to see a healthcare provider that's not traditionally considered healthcare. So what we're trying to do with this project is link in a lot of those other factors into health outcomes. And you can see on these maps here just how disparate the diabetes outcomes are across race and across place within Durham County. So this is a breakdown by the race and ethnicity of the patient, and the scale for all these maps are the same, right? The Core Plus scale there. So that was the challenge. How do we make this data useful? And also, this is our data, right? Like for everybody in the county, this literally comes from people's medical records. So that's been one of our talking points is this is your data. This is literally information about you. So how can we make it useful at the neighborhood level without making it stigmatizing? And how can we move away from, on the left is kind of like the first formal county report of this data, which is, not that the county does great work, but like you see a lot of this stuff in public health and it's not useful. Or not very interpretable. And then also moving beyond that, we're really starting to learn in this project that we come at it with a collective impact model, like let's look at the things in your neighborhood that are impacting everybody and making everybody's health worse. But the really interesting thing is that conversation very quickly and easily leads into a conversation about individual action, like, oh, how can you eat better? How can you exercise more? But when it starts from a place of collective impact, it's not a stigmatizing conversation. And then it also opens up the door for people to share information about different lifestyle changes they've made in their own lives rather than having a public health worker come in and say, like, do X, Y, and Z. So we've had some really interesting conversations in neighborhoods around this data. And I think starting with that collective impact framework opens up the door to then talk about individual behavioral changes. So our design process for this, this is kind of a little bit of a framework of a co-design process that I've been using on a few projects now. And we did it on over about a year time frame on this project, so it really took quite a long time. We started by reviewing existing visualizations of this data and going with those visualizations before stakeholders and community members, health outreach workers, and doing gallery walk activities, and I'll talk about that in a sec. We then developed user stories for this application. And then at the same time, I built a technical proof of concept just to see, like, here are some of the things we think we might want to do. Is this totally technically impossible, or is it something that we might be able to do? And that was also something that we could shop around to people and say, hey, we built this thing, build some buy-in, like it actually exists on the web, you can go look at it, it's not perfect. So we did that about a year ago, and it's still live. And then we moved from that to a conceptual design for the final project, and then we've been doing continually, really, over the fall, as this has developed, more workshops and more engagement. So we started, one of the tools we used a lot was gallery walks. A gallery walk is a tool for getting feedback from a group of folks, or it's a facilitation tool for having a conversation. And basically you put a lot of stuff all around the room and you get people in groups and they walk around to different stations and then they give feedback or give thoughts on the things at their station. So for our workshops we collected a bunch of existing visualizations of social determinants of health issues, some of which we'd created, some of them the county department had created. We put them in different clusters around the room, and we asked folks to, like, put a star on the thing that you like most, put a red dot on the things that you find confusing, write your questions on sticky notes. And we did this both with both in neighborhood workshops, like in community centers, and also this one, the photo on the left, that's a group of, like a network of public health workers that are looking at this. And so it was really interesting to review this existing work. Does anyone have a guess, like, of these visualizations, like which ones people would resonate most with? Yeah, right? Yeah, so hands down, like this visualization, which it's not a data visualization, but everyone's like, that's the one that I get. And then kind of the second one actually was this one, which is about race and employment and wages in the health industry. And the reason folks resonated with that was everybody, when we were talking to Black and Latinx communities, everyone was like, oh yeah, at this job I got paid less than this white guy who got promoted to manager. I could resonate with that graphic. So like there's a mix of the graphic stuff and then also like the themes that people can actually connect with in their daily life. Then we use this model called a consensus workshop, and this comes from a facilitation method called technology of participation, which they do awesome trainings nationally. And the consensus workshop is a tool to ask a specific question to a group of people and get them to answer it collectively. And so what we did is we asked, and we are continuing to ask in neighborhoods across Durham, what factors influence the health of people living in your neighborhood? So we start out the workshop, it takes about an hour. We cluster, this is kind of like a halfway done answer. We cluster all these topics and we end up with a picture of what influences health in each individual neighborhood, and a lot of the things are the same, but some of the things are different. So it's a way to kind of vet like what are we focusing on in our work against what people are really dealing with in their daily life. So we kind of come in with this framework about like, here are the 4 major categories of things that influence health at the neighborhood level: access to healthcare, access to physical activity, healthy food, environmental stress factors. And then here's an example of a neighborhood workshop output. This one is Birchwood Heights, and you'll see I've kind of circled in red the things that weren't on our radar. So mental health and spiritual health and counseling were like really big. Family health wasn't in our kind of the 4 categories that come from the literature at all. Also economics and demographics came up a lot. So we've used that a little bit to kind of like tweak what we're including in the stories that we tell. Then I built this technical proof of concept, and I just put up a framework to highlight as Plotly Dash, if anyone wants to look into that. It's a pretty quick way to build these like rapidly prototyped reactive web applications, and then once you start getting more complicated, it starts getting really difficult to use. So here's what the proof of concept looks like. It's really, in some ways it's kind of ugly and it's not really that approachable, but one of the things we wanted to test was this idea of doing data-driven text that actually narrates what's going on in a way that gives the key takeaways. So this kind of do you know text. And I wanted to see like, how crazy am I for thinking that we could, like for each track, generate these sentences that say like, hey, this is what's important here, in the same way that somebody would narrate what's going on. And that's kind of where we moved with the project concept. At the center, this is an example of the project design actually translated into Spanish, and then behind there is kind of a conceptual worksheet that we did, or sample worksheet that we did about 3 months ago of the project. And where we're moving is really coming out of these experiences and the workshops of having people go to a map and narrate what's happening in that map. We're trying to build a website that conveys the important information about each tract in the city, but that can really interlink with neighborhood workshops. So it can be printed out as a handout. You can take screen caps of it like I did here and print them out on big sheets of paper and use them in a gallery walk activity. And in addition to all the data content, there's always these like key takeaway bullet points that are written in more conversational tone, like the access to bus stops in this neighborhood is the highest in the county, or this neighborhood has really low tree coverage. And then we're using these engaging graphics. One of the really exciting things coming off that experience that folks resonated with the cartoon is we said, well, can we use cartoons to actually tell these stories about neighborhood health? So we came up with this idea of doing a data-driven neighborhood scene. So there's the static example on the right, and this was kind of the concept that we hired an illustrator to draw. And the idea on the app is that as you first load, and I'll show this in a sec, any given tract, you see a neighborhood scene where the elements in it are generated by what's actually happening in that neighborhood based on data. And so I'll demo the site for a sec here. See if we can get this over here. Okay, so this is what the site looks like right now, and it's not super optimized for this screen size because most mobile screens are taller, and the screen is pretty low resolution. But basically, a few things we came up with. We created these neighborhood names instead of census tracts, even though we're using census tract geographies. And there's this toggle button that you can change neighborhood tracts there. And then as you come into a different neighborhood, you see this scene that has different components that are generated by the data we have. And as you mouse over, you get an explanation of why those components are represented. So here's somebody carrying home groceries because 30% of households in the area are within a quarter-mile walking distance of a full-service grocery store. The reason that she's in this picture is that that number is actually pretty high for the county. And so it's significant. 98% of households are near a bus stop. And one of the interesting things in user testing with this app is that some people would never scroll below this screen, and that's why we added these rollovers so you can get the information. Originally, this was a static image, but some people got so entranced by the visuals that they never noticed there was the rest of the app. So as you scroll down, you get some more descriptions of the place. You get a map. This is Mapbox GL. There's another way to choose geographies here that zooms in and out that I kind of like there. You get the health outcomes. And then you get this kind of overview information. So this text is static, but then everything else down here is data generated. And we added this dynamic visualization here of how these numbers sit in relation to the county average of the data. And then as you can see, there's still some things that need to get built. But really the concept here is kind of drawing on this mix of what are the key takeaways, what are the high level takeaways, and then giving people options to dig in more in our other products which allow you to actually map stuff across the city in the neighborhood compass. And then at the very bottom, one of the things that we pull in is assets and resources in that part of the city. So where can you go to get family counseling services? Where are the preschools in your area? And this is an area, this is a piece of the site that actually needs some work too, because there's not good, reliable data about neighborhood resources that's updated annually and that's well categorized. And so we're having to kind of take that work on ourselves. And it's been interesting as we're testing this, because we tested this, for example, with workers at a community healthcare center, and they said, oh, this is great. We should point our patients to this app so they can see where to find a grocery store, because there's nowhere they can look to get a list of WIC grocery stores in their neighborhood. And I was like, well, that's not at all our use case. But it's also crazy that that app doesn't exist yet. So going a little bit under the hood of the app. So we use, at DataWorks, we use this kind of framework for most of our applications. So there's a GitHub data repo, which is really just a folder that has a lot of CSV files that has all the static data in it, and those can be edited in Excel, or they can be generated by R or generated by other scripts. And those get built into JSON files through a Circle CI server, which is a continuous integration service that builds the app every time anything gets updated, and then it gets stored in the cloud on Amazon S3. So one of the cool things about this framework is the site itself is just a bunch of static files that you point your browser at to download, so we don't need to run a server. So there's no server overhead on our end because all the data gets baked in the build process. And we can do that because we're only dealing with a small number of data points and a small number of neighborhoods, so it's not like a massive overhead that we need a live Postgres server or anything. We use Vue.js for this project, which I would really highly recommend, actually, after working with it a lot. One of the cool things about it is it's basically HTML and JavaScript and CSS with data bound into it, with data attributes added. So it makes it really easy to prototype. So we had our site designers build a static HTML site, and then I came in and added the data interactivity on top of it, but I was able to start with their code directly and then just bind in the data. And one of the things that I found was super cool in this process is that actually I developed this prototype in Illustrator for a survey we did, and then I was like, oh, I can actually just literally export that prototype into SVG code, which is valid markup that can go in HTML5 now. I can paste it into the app, and then I can just add the data points where I need to add the data points. So I'm used to thinking, let me prototype it in Illustrator and then figure out how to build it in D3 or something, and it turned out I could just go directly there. So I was super excited about that. It made my life really easy. A few new questions that this raised for us. One is census versus lived geography. So all our data is at census tracts, but nobody knows their tract number. Did anybody here know their census tract number? Right. So we ended up hemming and hawing about the weirdness of two random dudes doing this, but ended up just writing neighborhood names for every neighborhood in the city from the list of 63 census tracts. I'm really glad we did it. I'm sure we'll get some feedback and tweak some of them, but it's a really good starting point, I think. And it's super changed people's relationship to the app. So once we added the names in, people started really thinking about their own neighborhoods in good and bad ways, because they were like, wait, but this neighborhood scene doesn't show the university that's in my neighborhood. Where's the university? Or like, where's that stop sign that, or like, where's, so, and we were like, that's not supposed to show that. And we didn't get those questions when it was just labeled by census tract. We started getting them when people were saying, oh, this is NC Central, where's NC Central? So it raised some questions about realism in the illustrations with an approach like this. And then also this question of binning. We're really used to thinking about like Jenks breaks or quantiles or whatever. Those work well on a map where you're showing like the whole range of data, but when you're looking at an individual tract in this app, and I say something like this tract is much bigger than the county average, you want that to actually mean something. And for some data points like grocery store proximities, actually, there's nowhere that's really bad. There's very few places that are really good, and then most things are clustered around the average. So rather than using the kind of binning we would do on a map where you're going for a good range of contrast across the full range of data, we're actually using a different kind of binning on this app that's so that for each tract, the perceptual description of whether it's actually high or low is more accurate. And that was kind of interesting to dig into a little bit. And then this time is going by so quickly. Lastly, I wanted to talk a little bit about user testing, kind of as a takeaway from this talk for folks. And a major thanks to Steve Krug's book, Don't Make Me Think, which is like a great basic web design text, but he has a whole chapter on user design, and he has scripts at sensible.com for how to do all this. But user testing is a process where you sit down one-on-one with somebody and you work through the site without telling them anything about it. So you get them to load it up, and you ask a lot of leading questions like, what are you seeing now? What are you thinking? When you click there, what were you expecting to happen? But you never tell people what's going on. It's really difficult to like sit on your hands during that, and it's been incredibly helpful. And always asking leading questions. And we found it really helpful to work in pairs, one person to take notes and one person to drive the user testing experience. I would just like so recommend this. We did 6 people in 1 week, and it just totally changed my understanding of how anybody actually uses our app, and really drove home that it was a useful and good product at the same time. So some takeaways we got, different people navigate websites. We had 2 people using this app who, like I said, were stuck on the illustrations, and they kept on saying like, well, this is cool, but it'd be really cool if you broke down like different categories and then had some indicators for each category and then gave us the data values for each indicator. And I was like, literally, like if you scroll down, that is exactly what this app does. But but they just never saw that. And so we had to keep realize that some people are going to navigate the site and never see that in the real world, because we're not going to be there to say, hey, scroll down, even though we had a little scroll indicator and nobody saw it. So it just really drove home that experience. Some people read everything through and just scroll from top to bottom and see everything on the other hand. And then one question we had was what to do with. We got a lot of like, well, I like this, but somebody else would find it confusing. Like, I don't know, like other users would. And it was like, well, who are those other users? Because we haven't run into them yet in our testing. So that was a question I had. Another big takeaway we had from user testing was this realism versus metaphor thing I kind of hinted at before. So a lot of people saw the app, they were like, oh, this is super cool. I love the pictures. It's like a game. And they're like, ooh, I wonder what happens if we go to a rich neighborhood. It's going to look awesome, right? And then it was like, well, we don't have that kind of qualitative data. It's just like it has some more trees, and like maybe the housing density is a little bit lower, but like there's nobody having like a party in their swanky mansion. So one of the things that it challenged me and our graphic designer to do is figure out like, can we build in a few things that will kind of like get at those qualitative geographies of the city. Similarly, around race and class, we had a lot of discussion about the icon at the top. That's your top right of the screen there of somebody getting arrested. That was like absolutely the biggest touch point in our conversations in user testing. And one thing that was really interesting is we heard from white folks, you can't show people this. And we heard from black folks, this is triggering, but it's super accurate. And I'm glad that you're showing it. So So we have been thinking a lot about how to portray arrests, and there's a few things we're going to change in this situation. One is generating like a lot of different race and ethnicity combinations in the situation, and another is putting it behind a cop car, so you're not seeing like the full handcuff stuff. It's a little bit less triggering for somebody who's had direct experience with the police, but it still gets at what's happening. So that was one piece that we're iterating. And then this lady walking a poodle, like I love the characters and the emotions in this app, and everybody's like, oh yeah, gentrification. That lady is a dog walker gentrifying, and like actually she just shows up when there's high walkability. So we had to figure out how do we measure gentrification? Do we add a new data point just to control that? Because people are going to get that takeaway from the message. So this piece about working with graphics is just it's been really mind-opening for me and for our team this year, and I'm really excited about thinking about like, is this cartography? How does this relate to cartography? How would this approach work in other contexts? Like, would these graphics work for other cities? It's just raised a lot of questions about kind of like what we do and what the limits of maps are and what the possibilities of other data-driven approaches are. So I'll close with big thanks to all the partners on this project. John Killeen at DataWorks North Carolina, who's just an incredible champion of like, yeah, let's figure out how to do this the right way. Sure, let's do a community workshop about it, which is really rare in my experience. The Durham County Department of Public Health, which is similarly really excited about new approaches. Q Weideman, our illustrator, they do phenomenal work and just like could not recommend their work enough. Complex Creative, the web design team, and then Ann Tomasevich, who's been doing a lot of the interactive, the actual like CSS styling. And then we work with a great language justice co-op that's doing the translations. I didn't get a chance to dig into that, but translating Vue.js apps is harder than it ought to be. So I'd be happy to talk to folks about that experience as well. And I think like we're at about time, right? So yeah. Yeah.
Does anybody have any questions? Hi, so I'm actually from like the public health world, I guess, and I know that there are a lot of indicators. A lot of organizations create dashboards and interfaces to try to communicate vulnerability or just various things about neighborhoods or whatever the enumeration area is. I guess, did you look at all at other projects and other interfaces, and was there anything that those organizations did that you tried to emulate or tried to do something like very different? I guess what was the experience kind of doing the beforehand research before you tried to develop something that was your own?
We did, and I'm always seeing more projects too, so it wasn't necessarily comprehensive, but we looked at like 500 cities as one major project, and one of the things we liked a lot about the folks that are doing this work in public health is using really creative infographics. I think there's one on that slide. Yeah, like there's one from our health department, or this is the CDC, but our health department does similar stuff, and I think, there's actually a lot of really creative visual design on that kind of stuff that's coming out of the public health world. But one of the things that was a challenge or was different was that there's not a lot of sites that have this granular level of data at the tract level, either about disease or about outcomes. And the thing is, that's really where the differences show up and where people can have an impact. So we found, for example, for the 500 cities data on diabetes, our diabetes rates were 50% higher countywide than 500 cities predicted they would be. And then within that, they varied a ton neighborhood to neighborhood. So yeah, if you know of other examples that really dig down to the neighborhood level, I'd love to hear that. And we have, like every time we do a community workshop, we go in with a public health outreach worker as well, who's able to do like a diabetes screener with folks in the room and, give some healthy eating tips and stuff like that. So it's definitely like a partnership with that world, and I'm learning a lot about how to communicate about even the language, like using people with diabetes instead of diabetics. A lot of that came out of the public health department, for sure.
Did HIPAA regulations hinder some of your work, or were you able to get the data you needed to do this?
Yeah, so the question was about HIPAA. Yes and no. So one of the ways this project worked is that and I don't know all the legal specifics, but the County Department of Public Health has the legal authority to request data even if it's HIPAA protected. And it's not like, it wasn't a situation where that was like an adversarial request, but because it's within their legal purview, it allows Duke to release the data and still be in compliance with HIPAA in a way that they couldn't on their own. So one of the pieces with this project is that the county health department formally requests the data. Duke does the work to make sure that it's like aggregated to small areas and that there's not, confidentiality issues where there's like one patient of a certain race in a certain area. So they strip out some of those categories the same way the census does. And then they provide it to the health department, and then the health department provides it to us. And all of that is because of HIPAA. And it's also been a huge investment, I think, within the health system at Duke. I think it was like a couple $100,000 for them to develop, which is probably more than it should have been, but for them to develop the statistical methodology to like reliably provide this data year after year. So we're kind of getting to the point where that's going to be a yearly data availability eventually.
So you brought up gentrification in Durham, and this is an emerging issue. So my question is more about the data sources you use, because you could look at the ACS over 5 years in a place like East Durham and not really see gentrification, but you live in East Durham and you live gentrification. So kind of how you deal with data sources and data availability on emerging issues and kind of what that looks like in the future.
Yeah, that'll probably be my talk next year because we're actually like, once this wraps up, one of the things we're launching is a bigger project on equitable development and data indicators for that. And so some of the things we've been doing is getting evictions data from the sheriff's department. That comes out monthly, and it's point specific. So we can do like heat maps, point clustering, and really see X thing happened. So one of the findings from that, for example, is that when large-scale apartment complexes, like garden apartment complexes, change hands, there's a cluster of evictions that happens pretty immediately, and that is happening reliably across the city. So that is displacement. Even maybe it might be gentrification, maybe not. Another piece is that we've been scraping Craigslist data for the past 2 years. And just dumping it in a PostGIS database and waiting to do something with it around rental rates across the city. So we have like a pretty accurate record of every property that's been listed on Craigslist or PadMapper for 2 years. And we're trying to figure out like how to actually do something around gentrification with that. But no, it's a huge challenge to get up to the minute data for sure. And we'll have the 2020 census soon enough too. So I think that'll provide a pretty real picture.